Sandra Bullock stepped into the grand hall of the charity event, her simple gray dress standing in stark contrast to the lavish surroundings. As she walked, she felt the scrutinizing gazes of high society, adorned in shimmering gowns and dazzling jewels. In a discreet corner, two elegantly dressed women whispered behind their champagne glasses. "Look at that outfit! How embarrassing!" one scoffed. "This is a gala, not a casual diner meet-up." What they didn't know, however, was that Sandra was no ordinary guest. She was the night's lead donor and a close friend of Keanu Reeves, the event's organizer. Soon, they would realize the gravity of their mistake, and they would pay for it with their reputations. What Keanu Reeves does next will leave you speechless, and Sandra Bullock's response will be words they'll never forget. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you love stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, we have another special story just for you. The grand ballroom was bathed in the glow of hundreds of dazzling chandeliers, their light reflecting the opulence of the evening. The air carried a blend of expensive perfumes and the crisp scent of bubbling champagne, served by waiters in immaculate uniforms. The charity gala was one of the most highly anticipated events of the year, drawing Hollywood's elite, powerful business moguls and esteemed figures of high society. Women in shimmering gowns and diamond necklaces glided gracefully through the crowd, engaging in carefully curated conversations with impeccably dressed executives. At the entrance, a glowing red carpet stretched beneath the flashing cameras, capturing every arrival, as high-profile guests stepped out of luxury vehicles. And then she arrived. Sandra Bullock emerged from a modest, unassuming car. No entourage, no bodyguards, no theatrical display. She wore a simple, yet elegant gray dress, devoid of extravagant jewelry or excessive shimmer. Her hair was styled in a neat updo, and her minimal makeup highlighted her natural beauty. She walked the red carpet without seeking attention, yet she commanded it effortlessly. Her charisma needed no grand gestures. The photographers turned their lenses toward her, captivated by her quiet elegance. A few photographers snapped pictures of Sandra, but their attention quickly shifted to the next arrivals. Two women, stepping out of a sleek black limousine, draped in dazzling gold gowns and adorned with oversized diamond jewelry. They were Eleanor Cartwright and Vivian Saint. James, known not only for their immense wealth, but also for their sharp tongues and scrutinizing gazes. As they passed Sandra, they made no effort to conceal their disapproving, evaluative stares. Then came the first whisper. Sandra stepped into the ballroom and immediately felt the weight of the glances. These weren't looks of admiration or curiosity. They were judgmental. She knew she didn't fit the expected image of the evening. Here, appearances were a silent currency, and by their standards, she wasn't spending enough. Still, she ignored it, reminding herself why she was here: to support an important cause, to help raise funds for at-risk children. But just as she reached for a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, the murmurs grew louder. As Sandra reached for her champagne, a hushed remark made her pause. Poor Sandra. Did no one tell her this is a gala, not a casual dinner? The voice belonged to Eleanor Cartwright, syrupy sweet but laced with venom. Beside her, Vivian Street James smiled with feigned sympathy. I do admire her effort, really. But some people just don't understand what it means to be in this kind of environment. Sandra felt a tight knot form in her stomach. She wasn't naive. She knew some circles thrived on superficiality. But hearing them speak as if she weren't even there, that was something else. She didn't react. Instead, She took a slow sip of her champagne and walked away. But the night was only beginning. As Sandra moved through the ballroom, exchanging polite conversation, she noticed a pattern. The most powerful and influential guests seemed indifferent to her, not because they disrespected her as an actress, but because, in the unspoken social hierarchy of the evening, she didn't appear important enough. A brief pang of discomfort hit her, but she steadied herself. "I'm here for the cause," she reminded herself. That's when a waiter approached discreetly. "Excuse me, Miss Bullock, but your seating arrangement has been changed." She frowned. Changed? To where? The waiter hesitated. "To a secondary table." For a moment, Sandra felt the weight of it. She hadn't just been ignored. She had been deliberately sidelined. And she had a strong suspicion who was behind it. Across the room, Eleanor and Vivian exchanged smug glances. Sandra took a deep breath and walked toward her new seat. It was far from the main stage, away from the influential guests, almost a social exile. But just before sitting down, she caught something. Eleanor and Vivian were watching her closely, waiting to see if she would react. Sandra offered them a soft, knowing smile, and gracefully took her seat. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing even a hint of defeat. But deep down, she knew. This night was far from over. She tried to focus on the event, listening to speeches and watching presentations about the charity's mission. Yet, something caught her attention. Across the room, Eleanor and Vivian were whispering excitedly, their expressions filled with intrigue. Curious, Sandra subtly shifted her position, straining to catch their conversation. That's when she heard a familiar name. "Keanu Reeves," Vivian murmured in a conspiratorial tone. Sandra's brow furrowed slightly. "What does Keanu have to do with any of this?" Eleanor chuckled softly. "Oh, he has a special surprise planned for tonight. I think Sandra will love it." A chill ran down Sandra's spine. The way they spoke didn't make it sound like a good surprise. She kept her expression neutral, but her pulse quickened. What were they up to? The ballroom buzzed with energy as guests settled into their seats, waiters moving effortlessly between tables, serving exquisite dishes and filling crystal glasses with the finest wine. But Sandra couldn't shake the uneasy feeling building inside her. She already knew exactly who the host of the night was: Keanu Reeves. This charity gala was one of his most significant philanthropic projects, and he had personally invited her. He had assured her that tonight would be special. But now, Sandra wasn't so sure. Keanu had assured Sandra that her presence mattered. That's why, when she realized her assigned seat had been moved to a less prominent location, her initial surprise was tinged with disappointment. There was no way Keanu knew about this. Or did he? As Sandra settled into her new table, she quickly became aware that the whispers hadn't stopped. It wasn't just the glances, it was the words. And at the center of it all were Eleanor Cartwright and Vivian St. James. Sandra knew these women thrived on status. In their world, failing to display enough wealth was enough to warrant exclusion. Eleanor's voice rang out across the ballroom, coated in false surprise and amusement. "Funny how this event brings together all sorts of people, don't you think, Vivian?" The woman beside her smirked, playing along. "Oh, absolutely. Some people may think they belong here just because they were invited. But being invited doesn't mean you actually fit in." Sandra held her wine glass steady, feeling a slow burn rise in her chest. She knew they were talking about her. But what bothered her wasn't the insult itself. It was the fact that no one seemed to care. She tried to ignore the remarks, to focus on the cause she had come to support. But what had started as subtle discomfort was quickly turning into something more. Sandra's discomfort quickly escalated. The most influential guests avoided engaging with her. Some greeted her with a forced smile, while others acted as if she wasn't even there. She couldn't believe this was happening at Keanu's event. She had known him for years. She knew how much he valued purpose over appearance. So why was she being treated like she didn't belong? As the main course was being served, a waiter approached and discreetly placed a folded note beside her. Sandra opened it, her eyes scanning the handwritten words. "Sandra, darling, I hope you're enjoying yourself. If you ever need a proper dress for next year's event, I know some wonderful stylists. Kisses, Eleanor." Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just a passive-aggressive remark. It was a direct attack, delivered in front of everyone. She clenched the paper slightly between her fingers, lifting her gaze toward Eleanor and Vivian. Across the room, they watched her with amused smirks, waiting for her reaction. Sandra took a slow, steady breath. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. But now, she was certain this was bigger than petty insults. Something else was happening. She wasn't leaving. But she needed a moment away to collect herself. Excusing herself discreetly, Sandra stepped outside into the garden. The cool night air brushed against her skin as she took a sip of champagne, trying to process everything. Keanu had personally invited her. He knew she didn't care about extravagance. So why was she being treated as if she didn't belong? She didn't have long to think. Just as she was about to return to the ballroom, familiar voices stopped her in her tracks. Eleanor and Vivian. They stood near the side entrance, speaking in hushed yet excited tones. Sandra had no interest in eavesdropping until she heard one name that made her freeze: Keanu Reeves. Sandra's heart pounded. What did he have to do with them? Vivian laughed, her voice dripping with secrecy. "Oh, he has a special surprise planned for tonight. I think Sandra will love it." Eleanor smirked. Or maybe not. A chill ran down Sandra's spine. Their tone was anything but reassuring. For the first time that night, she felt a true sense of unease. What did Keanu have to do with this? And what exactly were they planning? Trying to distance herself from their toxicity, she slowly stepped away, only to catch another whispered mention of Keanu Reeves's name. The conspiratorial tone, the veiled amusement. It was clear they knew something she didn't. But Sandra wasn't about to let them rattle her. She returned to the ballroom without rushing, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. She already knew the type of people she was dealing with. Eleanor and Vivian were nothing new. Women who thrived on status and believed exclusivity meant exclusion. It was pathetic. And the funniest part? They actually thought she cared. Sandra picked up a glass of wine from a passing waiter, taking in the scene around her. From the outside, the event seemed flawless, luxury, smiles, polite conversations. But now, she saw it for what it really was: a performance. And some people were truly terrible actors. As she moved toward her table, she noticed how the glances had shifted. The same guests who had previously greeted her were now suddenly avoiding eye contact, suddenly very interested in their meals. Others gave her slow, measured once-overs, silently assessing her. Sandra almost laughed, as if a simple dress and the absence of diamonds somehow made her invisible in this room. Poor souls. If only they knew just how little she cared about their opinions. She casually plucked a canapé from a passing tray and kept walking, unfazed. The forced silence around her was almost amusing. From across the room, Vivian was watching closely. She leaned toward Eleanor, whispering something while making sure Sandra saw her smirk. Sandra rolled her eyes internally. This is straight out of a bad high school movie. Two grown, wealthy women acting like petty teenagers, playing their little game of social exclusion. It was laughable. Sandra took another sip of wine and decided to flip the script. She looked directly at Vivian and smiled. A genuine, effortless smile. Vivian blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She had been expecting discomfort, maybe even a hint of embarrassment. Instead, Sandra lifted her glass in a silent toast before taking another sip. Vivian's face stiffened. She didn't like losing control, and in that moment, she realized she had none over Sandra. Then, across the room, Sandra spotted a familiar face, Michael Whitmore, a well-known actor, philanthropist, and one of the few people at this event who actually seemed to care about more than just status. She considered walking over to him, but then she stopped. Michael was deep in conversation with Vivian. Sandra watched as Vivian leaned in, speaking softly, her expression carefully controlled. Michael listened, nodding occasionally, his brow furrowed as if considering her words. Sandra didn't feel angry, but she was disappointed. Michael was smart enough to know what kind of person Vivian was. If he was actually listening to her, entertaining her words, then maybe he wasn't as trustworthy as he appeared. A shame, but not a surprise. Sandra returned to her table, absent-mindedly playing with her fork as the murmurs continued around her. The glances, the hushed whispers, it was all so predictable. The ridiculous part, none of it bothered her. If anything, it was entertaining. These people took themselves far too seriously, as if this ballroom was the center of the universe, and a simple dress choice was an unforgivable crime. She took another bite of her meal, wondering how much longer she'd have to sit through this absurd performance. Then, from the next table, a hesitant voice broke through the noise. "Sandra, can I ask you something?" She looked up. Of course. The woman hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "I heard some people saying that. Maybe you're only here because of Keanu." Sandra let out a small, amused laugh. "Eleanor and Vivian, right?" The woman looked embarrassed, but nodded. Sandra leaned forward, resting her elbow on the table. She met the woman's gaze directly. "Tell me, do you really believe Keanu invites people out of pity?" The woman blinked, uncertain. I don't know," Sandra smirked. "Sure you do. But it's easier to pretend you don't." The woman flushed, quickly looking away. Sandra took another sip of wine, savoring the silence that followed. She didn't owe anyone an explanation, and soon they would all understand why. Dinner was winding down, and all eyes turned toward the stage. A host stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. Before we conclude, we have the honor of inviting the man who made this event possible. Please welcome." Sandra glanced toward the stage, her lips curling slightly. "Keanu Reeves." And the moment he spoke, everything would change. Because Keanu didn't play these ridiculous social games. Eleanor and Vivian thought they had power, but Keanu had something they could never buy: respect. And the fun was just beginning. The room erupted in applause as Keanu Reeves took the stage. Sandra crossed her arms, finishing the last sip of her wine. Finally, Eleanor and Vivian were laser-focused, their anticipation palpable. They were expecting something grand, something that would work in their favor. Sandra, on the other hand, was simply curious. What exactly was this surprise Keanu had planned? Keanu approached the microphone with his usual relaxed demeanor, waiting for the room to settle before speaking. "First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. This cause means a lot to me, and seeing so many people come together to support it is truly incredible. Another round of applause. Keanu continued. Many of you are familiar with the work this organization does, but tonight I want to highlight someone very special. Someone whose dedication and impact often go unnoticed, but deserve to be recognized. Sandra raised an eyebrow. She hadn't been expecting this. This person has been instrumental in supporting charitable causes, never for recognition, but simply because they care. Keanu said, smiling, I'm talking about Sandra Bullock. For a moment, the entire ballroom went silent. Then applause erupted once more. Sandra remained composed, but inside she was highly amused. Discreetly, she glanced toward Eleanor and Vivian's table. They looked stunned, the exact opposite of what they had anticipated. Keanu continued, What many of you may not know is that Sandra has been one of the biggest donors and supporters of this cause. Not only has she contributed financially, but she has also been actively involved in ensuring these projects reach further than we ever imagined. The applause grew louder. Sandra smiled, not out of vanity, but at the sheer irony of it all. Eleanor and Vivian had spent the entire night trying to diminish her, and now Keanu was placing her at the center of recognition. Their plan had backfired spectacularly. Vivian whispered something frantically to Eleanor, whose tense response came quickly. Sandra watched them, enjoying every second of their discomfort. They had expected Keanu to highlight the exclusivity of the evening, to mention high-profile figures, maybe even to put them in the spotlight. Instead, he had publicly uplifted the one person they had tried to tear down. The universe has a perfect sense of humor. Keanu then turned to Sandra. Sandra, if you would, I'd love for you to come up here. The crowd applauded again. Sandra exhaled, smiling subtly. For a brief moment, she considered declining. Then she caught a glimpse of Eleanor and Vivian's faces, shock and frustration written all over them. Irresistible. She calmly set her glass on the table and stood, making her way toward the stage with effortless confidence. Every step felt like a quiet victory. When she reached Keanu's side, he greeted her with a warm smile. "Thank you, Keanu," she said, as he handed her the microphone. The stage was hers. Sandra scanned the audience. She hadn't prepared a speech. She didn't need one. I've always found it amusing how people assume doing good things means seeking recognition, she said, her voice steady. I've never cared about being in the spotlight because, to me, helping is something you do, not something you showcase. A murmur spread through the room. She continued, Being here tonight and receiving this recognition is unexpected, but meaningful, because it reminds me that in the end, what truly matters. It's funny, Keanu said, lifting his glass toward Sandra with a knowing smile. She clinked hers against his. If they thought they could take me down with gossip, they seriously underestimated my patience. Keanu chuckled. What gets me is how people cling so desperately to the idea of status, like it actually means something in the grand scheme of things. Sandra nodded, her gaze sweeping across the room. The most amusing part? Watching how quickly people changed their attitude after your speech, as if a public tribute from someone influential suddenly determined my worth. She took a slow sip of her wine, letting the thought settle. One moment, I'm invisible, she continued. The next, I'm the person they must be seen talking to. But it's not respect, it's survival. They realized they backed the wrong side, and now they're scrambling to adjust. Keanu smirked. Predictable. Sandra glanced toward Eleanor and Vivian's table. The two women sat in silence, the weight of their defeat heavy in the air. Vivian no longer wore her smug expression, her grip tight around her wine glass. Eleanor, always the picture of composure, was struggling to mask her discomfort. They had spent the entire night trying to diminish her, using status as a weapon, and yet, in the end, they had played themselves. Sandra turned back to Keanu, the ghost of a smile on her lips. Lesson of the night? Keanu raised an eyebrow. She smirked. True influence isn't about who you know, it's about who respects you. Keanu exhaled. People rely on external validation to decide who deserves respect. But real respect? It doesn't need validation. Sandra turned to him. That's why you've never played this game. You never cared about the performance. Keanu smirked. And neither did you. I guess that's why we've always gotten along. Sandra laughed. Do you think people will remember this night? Keanu shrugged. Maybe some will, but most will go on believing that status and wealth are all that matter. Sandra glanced toward Eleanor and Vivian. Neither of them were smiling anymore, and others will remember it forever. Keanu nodded. Yeah, some will. As Sandra and Keanu stepped out of the ballroom, the night air felt different, lighter. Before getting into the car, Sandra took one last look at the event that had begun with so many false appearances and ended with undeniable truths. She turned to Keanu and smiled. I think we learned something tonight. Keanu raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Sandra opened the car door, but paused, looking at him one last time. It doesn't matter what you wear, who you associate with, or what people think of you. She smiled. The only thing that truly matters is who you are when no one is watching. Keanu returned her smile, and you've always known that. Sandra stepped into the car, and Keanu watched as she drove away. The event was over, but the lesson from that night would last far longer. If you enjoyed this story, there are many more that will inspire and uplift you. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, resilience, and the power of staying true to yourself.